Right, welcome everybody to the Weller Bookworks channel for a live chat today with Nicholas Seabrook, author of a fantastic book on what I now know is pronounced gerrymandering. One Person, One Vote, a surprising history of gerrymandering in America. I am Catherine Weller. I am new books buyer for Weller Bookworks, and I am also on the Redistricting Committee of the League of Women Voters of Utah. This event is sponsored by Weller Bookworks and co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Utah and the League of Women Voters of Salt Lake. Before we get into it, I'd like to introduce Nicholas Seabrook. Nicholas is a professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of North Florida. He is the author of Drawing the Lines, Constraints in Gerrymandering in U.S. Politics, as well as his new book, and he lives in Jacksonville, Florida. This event is streaming live on Facebook Live. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those into the chat. But for the start, Nicholas and I will be having a conversation about gerrymandering. So, Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Catherine. It's great to be here.
And let us get a start by talking about the far history of gerrymandering. Just give us a quick hit on our I don't want to say the hero of the story, but the namesake of our story, Mr. Gerry.
Well, I think we can probably say gerrymandering. It sounds a little unnatural today to use the historical pronunciation, but one of the stories that I tell in the book is how a lot of the popular beliefs about where gerrymandering came from and who it was invented by are not in fact accurate. They're pretty much myth. There's kind of this legend that gerrymandering originated in early 19th century Massachusetts, where the eponymous governor, Elbridge Gerry, whose name is also often mispronounced as Elbridge Gerry, but he was faced with a situation where he was kind of rapidly losing his political power in the state and allegedly hatched this conspiracy to rig the results of the upcoming Massachusetts Senate elections in 1812. And the way he supposedly went about doing that was to draw a district in Essex County, which packed in all of his Federalist opponents that he could possibly fit into the district, thus allowing his own political party, the Democratic Republicans, to win the bulk of the surrounding seats and hold on to their majority in the state Senate. And when the redistricting plan became public, a newspaper editor at the Boston Gazette, which was one of the major papers at the time, noticed that the district that Gerry had drawn kind of resembled a salamander when you looked at it on a map. And so by combining Gerry and salamander, the idea of the gerrymander, as it was then pronounced, was born. And from that initial publication in the Boston media, the idea really spread like wildfire throughout the United States. It was the famous cartoon, which I have on a version of on the cover of the book that people can see behind you, was reprinted in more than 80 newspapers across the nation within a year. It was kind of the trending topic of 1812. And by a year later, the Democratic Republicans in Massachusetts were getting in on the act too and putting together their own version of the gerrymander to try and put their thumb on the scale of the elections in their state. And this is the story about the origin of gerrymandering that I believed for many, many years, really up until I began researching this book, which was when I discovered that not only was Elbridge Gerry not responsible for this original gerrymander, he had basically, as the governor, he had signed it into law, but he had not really been involved in any of the details of the plan. It wasn't something that he had pushed for or advocated for. It was his fellow political party members in the state legislature who had really been been pushing this plan, and he had, if his biographers are to be believed, he had kind of gone along with it only grudgingly and had signed it into law. And so it's kind of unfortunate that this is really the thing that he is most remembered for today, because he went on to serve as Vice President of the United States under James Madison. He was a member of the Constitutional Convention. He was influential in the drafting of the Constitution, and yet today, not only his legacy, but his name has gone down in history as being associated with, and not just associated with, as being the inventor of this kind of unseemly practice of manipulating districts. But what I discovered also was that gerrymandering had been going on long before Elbridge Gerry. It had been happening during the founding era, and it had even been happening during the colonial era as well. So not only was he not responsible, this was not even the origin of the term that he came to be named and associated with.
Yeah, it's interesting because we think of gerrymandering these days is uniquely an American. And I think looking at how far back it goes into colonial history, we can certainly argue for that at this point in history, since we're basically the country that still facilitates gerrymandering, but because it is something that goes back to our colonial roots. The initial bombastic gerrymanderer, he was a piece of work, but so was Patrick Henry, who was such an effective user of the gerrymander that it's been argued, and I think you make a good argument for calling it the Henrymander.
Yeah, one of the things I really tried to do in the book was to focus on not just the political history, but also on some of the characters themselves, some of the individuals who were either associated with gerrymandering, who were perpetrators of gerrymandering, or who fundamentally had their lives and careers altered by some of the various gerrymanders that had happened throughout US history, and to really delve into their lives and their origin stories and how their lives intersected with this kind of unseemly practice of manipulating elections through the drawing of districts. And like a lot of our political traditions, the gerrymander was imported to the United States from England. It dates back to the historical English tradition of the Rotten Borough, which was the way that in the wake of the Magna Carta and the creation of the English Parliament, it was a way that the British aristocracy, once democracy started rearing its ugly head in British politics, tried to kind of keep the people in their place and ensure that they maintained what they saw as their God-given right to control the levers of power. And so manipulation of districts for political ends had a long tradition in British history. And so when some of these British figures, one of whom was, as you say, a colorful and bombastic character by the name of George Burrington, who was the British colonial governor of the North Carolina province. When he was appointed to that position, he kind of came from this British tradition of election rigging and skullduggery. And he immediately went to work implementing some of those practices in the colonies. And having been dismissed from his position as governor once for, among other things, assaulting the attorney general of the colony and threatening to murder the chief justice, which for most politicians would probably be something that brings your career to an end. But Burrington was very politically well connected. He was a close friend of the Duke of Newcastle, who was a highly influential figure in British politics at the time. And the King of England was actually indebted to him because his father had performed some kind of unspecified service to which there's no reference in the historical record as to what exactly it was. But having been dismissed from his position as governor once, Burrington was able to call in favors and get reappointed despite his earlier misconduct. And when he returned to North Carolina, he immediately set about flexing the muscles of his power to try and rig the results of the colony's legislative elections to ensure that he could put a majority of members in place that would support his agenda. And he did so by redrawing districts, by creating new districts where districts had not been present before, and essentially remaking the legislative map in his own image. And by doing so, he was able to bring the colony kind of firmly under his personal political control. And in the book, I argue that this was really the first American gerrymander, and we should really be calling it the Burrington, perhaps, or as you say, the Henrymander, because even before Elbridge Gerry, the founding fathers themselves were not averse to a little gerrymandering. And the long-running feud between some of the kind of titans of early Virginia politics, Patrick Henry on one side and the likes of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison on the other, kind of came to a head in 1788. So before the Constitution had been in place for even a year, the founding fathers themselves were starting to gerrymander the districts to try and keep each other out of Congress. And so what Patrick Henry did was, Henry was not a supporter of the US Constitution. And what he wanted to do was try and force a second constitutional convention in the hope that he could propose a whole bunch of different amendments that would reduce the power of the federal government and return that authority to the states. But one of the major obstacles in the way of that effort was James Madison, who was busy preparing the Bill of Rights, kind of the cornerstone of American liberty, which he was intending to introduce before the first Congress. And the Bill of Rights would be that compromise that would kind of shepherd the Union through these turbulent early years. And so Patrick Henry would stop at nothing to try and stop James Madison from making it to Congress and thwarting his plan for a second constitutional convention. And so what he did was to draw Madison's district in Orange County, Virginia, so that it had as many anti-federalists in it as possible, in the hope that he could rig the results and prevent Madison from getting elected. And not only that, he recruited the biggest heavyweight he could find to run against Madison in that district, none other than James Monroe, another hugely influential figure at the time. And this remains the only occasion in US history in which two future presidents have run against one another for a single seat in Congress. But despite Patrick Henry's best efforts, Madison ended up winning the election over James Monroe. He gets elected to Congress, he introduces the Bill of Rights, and the rest, of course, is history. But it's interesting to imagine how different things might have been if Patrick Henry had been successful. If he'd managed to keep Madison out of Congress, would we still have seen a Bill of Rights? Might it have looked very different from what we ultimately ended up getting? And could Patrick Henry have been successful at forcing a second constitutional convention? Might we have a very different constitution today were it not for this unsuccessful gerrymandering attempt?
It's unsettling to think about, isn't it? And I'm fascinated by that because Patrick Henry was such a good orator, as you described. Madison, not so much. And yet that was an unsuccessful gerrymander. There aren't a lot of unsuccessful gerrymanders that you describe in your book, are there?
I think historically, gerrymandering was generally less successful, or at least less effective than it is today. And one of the things that I focus on in the book is the idea that despite the fact that gerrymandering has always been with us, as long as there have been elections, as long as there have been districts, there have always been politicians who have tried to manipulate those districts to try and keep themselves in office, or to try and ensure that their own political party wins a majority. But the problem that Patrick Henry ran into was that he had he didn't really have any good data on what the voting population in Virginia looked like at the time. The best that he could come up with was to look at the number of militia members that were present in various different towns in Virginia and use that as a rough proxy for the overall population. And then he looked at how individual towns and cities had voted when it came to sending representatives to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And he figured that perhaps the more that those jurisdictions had voted for anti-federalists, maybe they would be more hostile to Madison. But it was really a pretty poor proxy for what ended up happening in the election. Despite Henry's best efforts, Madison ended up winning almost 60% of the vote in his district. And generally a lack of information, a lack of adequate and detailed enough data on who the people are in the state and where they live and who they might be inclined to vote for has been a significant hurdle for effective gerrymandering throughout a lot of US history. And that has really begun to change significantly in recent decades. Politicians have always had census data to rely on when it came to drawing districts, but it wasn't until the early 1970s that the very first computer software programs were developed in places like California to allow them to quickly and easily incorporate that data into a program that will allow them to sort of tinker with the districts and see what the implications of that might be for subsequent elections. And then, of course, in more recent years, we have all of the resources of big data. We have Facebook and all of these other companies we give our information to, compiling that, and that can be bought and sold. And there are just reams and reams of data available out there on what our preferences are, what we like, what we don't like. And the level of sophistication of the software that's available today kind of allows the people drawing districts to simulate how those districts will perform under a variety of hypothetical future conditions, and to kind of to tinker with the gerrymander in such a way that it remains robust over an entire decade, which is why, even though it's always been with us, I think gerrymandering is a far more significant threat to democracy today than it ever has been before, simply by virtue of this technology that's available.
Yeah, I would agree. And before we jump right into that technology, I do want to hit one other very important part of history that has really shaped the redistricting and gerrymandering landscape, and that is apportionment. You write some really great chapters in here about apportionment and what has happened with that over time. And I'd like you to expand upon how we came to this whole apportionment. And in particular, there's in fact, let's start with this, the phrase "one man, one vote." It means something very particular, and a lot of people don't really understand what it means in this context.
Yeah, and so for a lot of US history, politicians didn't really take too much care to ensure that the districts that they were drawing within a particular state had roughly equal populations to one another. They kind of made a good faith effort to try and roughly divide a state into districts of approximately equal population, but it was an imperfect science. And a lot of times, particularly as we get into the early 20th century, and the rise of the American city, as more and more Americans start moving to large urban centers, a lot of the districts in our states got very, very unbalanced in terms of population. And so you had rural districts where you perhaps had only a few thousand or even only a few hundred constituents who were represented by the politicians in those districts. And then you had urban districts in places like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, where there are tens or sometimes even hundreds of thousands of people. And so that really created an imbalance in political power, because people living in rural areas in America had much more influence over the workings of their state legislatures and the workings of Congress than Americans who lived in urban districts. And this problem had really become incredibly severe by the time we get to the 1960s. And there was a report that was issued in the early 60s by a congressman out of the state of Arizona that I talk about in the book, which showed that there were states in which districts had that had even several thousand more constituents in them than some of the smaller districts in those states. And the phrase "one person, one vote" comes from a series of Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s, which made it a constitutional requirement that all districts in state legislatures, all districts within a state in the US House of Representatives have almost precisely equal populations to each other. And this development was kind of a double-edged sword, because while it led to the dismantlement of some of these severely malapportioned districts that had been in use before, it got rid of the major power discrepancies between urban and rural areas. It ushered in this new era where politicians in every state would have to redraw all of their districts every decade, because once you get new census numbers that come in from the federal government, suddenly the districts that you had from the prior decade are no longer in compliance with the one person, one vote requirement. And all of those districts have to then be redrawn. And now that they were required to do redistricting every decade, and prior to that, this wasn't the way that things had worked. Redistricting did not happen in every state every single decade. But for the last 50 years, that has been the reality. And now that redistricting is happening so frequently, politicians have started realizing that they can manipulate that process for their own selfish ends. And I kind of define this as the era of the modern gerrymander, which kind of begins in the 1960s and really takes off in the 1980s. And that's the era we find ourselves living in today, where every 10 years in all 50 states, this process plays out where politicians have the opportunity to gerrymander the districts, as been happening here in Florida, as has been happening there in Utah, and has been happening in a lot of states across the nation.
Yeah. It's California is a really interesting case study in gerrymandering, and you describe the changes that California found and able to utilize modern data beginning in the 70s and leading up to a gerrymander by a Jerry. Our good friend Governor Jerry Brown. This was a gerrymander by Democrats that was pretty big in California, and they were using data in a whole new way, weren't they, Nick?
Yeah, so in the book, I described the 1980s as being really the first quintessentially modern gerrymandering cycle, because the computer models that had been developed the previous decade were starting to get used across the political spectrum. Democrats had them, Republicans had them, and in the 1980s in California, we saw a collision really between two of the most important figures in gerrymandering in the last kind of 50 years or so in US politics. On the Democratic side, you had Congressman Phil Burton, who was a San Francisco area representative and one of the most progressive politicians in the last 50 years. He was an advocate for the national park system and was influential in kind of setting aside the national wilderness for the enjoyment of all Americans. He was an influential voice during the AIDS crisis, and really someone who made it in his mission in life to ensure that the Democratic Party would win elections at all costs, because he saw that as being the most important thing that he could do to stand up for kind of the marginalized and the oppressed in our society. And on the other side of things, on the Republican side, was a guy by the name of Thomas Hofeller, which is a name that probably still most Americans have never heard, and certainly was a relatively unknown figure prior to his death in 2018. But he's someone who I make the case in the book is perhaps one of the most influential, if not the most influential, Republican political operatives of the last 50 years. That there, anytime you see a Republican gerrymander in recent decades, it's pretty likely that Thomas Hofeller has his fingerprints on it in one way or another. And so these two kind of went toe to toe in the 1980s, and Phil Burton ended up winning that battle largely because the Democrats were able to maintain control of the state legislature in Sacramento, and his gerrymander in the early 1980s is famous for this district that he drew in the San Francisco Bay area, where he kind of put together three disconnected areas: part of downtown San Francisco, part of the city of Vallejo across the San Francisco Bay, and then hopping across the San Francisco Bay again, he included this kind of large rural area of Marin County. And this was described at the time as the only district in California history to cross the San Francisco Bay twice without the use of a bridge. And Burton described it as his contribution to modern art, because it was kind of this abstract painting on the canvas of the state's political landscape. And those are two of my favorite characters from the book, kind of this flamboyant California congressman, and then this kind of buttoned up young Republican political operative. While Phil Burton unfortunately passed away at a relatively young age, not that long after this gerrymander occurred, Thomas Hofeller went on to be a hugely influential figure in gerrymandering all the way up to his death in 2018.
Let's talk about his legacy, Hofeller's legacy for gerrymandering. It's, as you said, his handprints are on today's gerrymandering activities.
Yeah, so he was working mostly in the state of California in the 1980s. He had been a consultant for the Republican caucus in the California state legislature. But by the time we get to the 1990s, he is now working for the Republican National Committee, and he's consulting with first the Reagan and then the Bush Departments of Justice. And the Republican Party found itself in an interesting position in the late 1980s and early 1990s because they wanted to try and stamp their influence on the districts. They wanted to try and influence gerrymandering so that they could help Republican candidates get elected. But they found themselves not being in control of the process in very many states, that Democrats were in control of state government in far more places at the time than Republicans were. And so what they figured out was that they could use the Department of Justice to try and influence the process in that way. And the solution they came up with, and this is both devious and ingenious, was to capitalize on some of the advances that had been made in securing voting rights for African Americans in the wake of the civil rights movement. You had not only the Civil Rights Act in 1964, but you also had the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which prohibited discrimination against racial and language minorities when it came to the drawing of districts. And so what Hofeller and the Attorney General at the time in the Bush administration, a guy by the name of Bill Barr, people will probably have heard of him, but most likely for his recent activities rather than what he was getting up to during his first stint as Attorney General. They realized that if they aggressively pushed states to draw majority minority districts, to draw districts where African Americans and Latinos represented a large majority of the population in the district, that would help Republican candidates in surrounding areas, because most of the minority voters that they were packing into those districts were Democrats. And so all of those Democratic votes were getting wasted, and this allowed Republicans to win a majority of the seats in surrounding areas. And so even though it was the Democrats who were in control of redistricting in these states, the Bush Department of Justice was able to use their influence over the process through the Voting Rights Act to push for the creation of these districts and to try and get states to add more and more districts where you had large majorities of minority voters, and they could kind of claim that they were pushing for equality and trying to ensure that that minority voters had a voice in the political process. And that was certainly true, but it had this side benefit for them of allowing Republicans to do better in the elections in those states. And this was influential in allowing Republicans to win back control of the House of Representatives in 1994, that they picked up a lot of districts in these southern states where the DOJ had been pushing for the creation of these majority-minority districts a couple of years earlier.
Yeah, and so now let's skip forward to the map-making process that we have now, involving the huge amount of data that you've already talked about, but also the increasingly sophisticated ways we can manipulate that program in the creation of maps.
Right. So one of the problems that gerrymandering faced in prior eras, and even up into the period where software became available, was that you could draw districts that were based on how people and how neighborhoods and areas had voted in previous elections. But it was very difficult to predict how those people might vote in future elections. That gerrymandering was based on past performance, but it wasn't capable of guaranteeing future results. A lot of times these gerrymanders would be effective for one election or two elections, and then people would have moved, the electorate would have changed, you would have swings in the popular vote created by popular presidents, unpopular presidents, and the problem they faced was that by later in the decade, the gerrymanders that they had created were no longer performing in the way that they had done in earlier elections. And that is the problem that gerrymanderers in the last couple of decades have been able to solve. And they've been able to solve it by developing sophisticated computer models that predict with a pretty high degree of accuracy how districts are likely to perform in future elections. They can anticipate what happens if an incumbent retires in this district and suddenly you have an open seat election. They can predict what will happen if you have an unpopular Republican presidential candidate in a particular year, or a particularly large Democratic wave election later on in the decade. And they can build a buffer into their gerrymander that will allow it to remain robust in the face of any of these plausible future scenarios. And this is the thing that really concerns me the most about gerrymandering as it has been practiced in the last couple of decades, that we face the very real possibility that politicians can use gerrymandering to manipulate districts, not just for a few elections, but for an entire decade, and almost get to the point where you're instituting single party rule in a given state. Because if a gerrymander holds up for an entire decade, by the time you get a new census and redistricting is happening again, the same political party is then going to get to draw the districts again. And they can kind of make modifications and make corrections based on what's happened in the intervening years. And this is what we see happening in places like here in Florida. It's what we see happening in places like Texas and Utah, where you have the same political party in charge today as you did 10 years ago. And that party has maintained control of the state legislature throughout the decade, partly because of gerrymandering. And perhaps the worst state for this right now is the state of Wisconsin, because after the 2010 census, the Republican Party happened to control both the state legislature and the governorship in the state of Wisconsin. And they put in place what I describe in the book as perhaps the most severe gerrymander in US history. They essentially rigged the results of elections to the Wisconsin state legislature. And what has happened is that in every election held in Wisconsin since then, Republicans have won close to 2/3 of the seats in the state assembly and the state senate. And this has occurred even in elections where Democrats have won the popular vote in Wisconsin overall. In fact, there have been 2 occasions in the last decade where Democrats have won the popular vote. More people have voted for Democrats than have voted for Republicans in the state of Wisconsin, and yet Republicans have maintained control of close to 2/3 of the seats in that state. And that's what really concerns me, that gerrymandering may have reached a level where it's so sophisticated and it's so robust that it becomes something that just gets rolled over from decade to decade. And you have parties being able to gerrymandering themselves almost into a permanent majority in a particular state.
So that brings us to what is to be done. And what is to be done, or what can be done these days, is affected by the rulings from the Supreme Court of a couple of years ago. And I'd like you to touch briefly on those and what that means for the avenue that is the legal challenge to a gerrymander.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about quite extensively in the book is this long and ultimately unsuccessful campaign to try and convince the US Supreme Court to step in and say that gerrymandering violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And this began all the way back in the 1980s. In fact, the very first partisan gerrymandering case to be decided by the Supreme Court happened in 1986. So we're going back to the very first decade of the era of modern gerrymandering. And unfortunately, on every occasion in which these cases have reached the justices have been hopelessly divided on how to approach trying to put together a standard to differentiate unconstitutional gerrymandering and kind of politics as usual, just politicians being politicians. And so in that 1986 decision, there was no majority opinion, there was no clear standard, there was no real test that the lower courts could apply moving forward, which is why we had another decade of gerrymandering in the 1990s. The Supreme Court heard another case in 2004, case coming out of Pennsylvania. At the time, you kind of had a 4-1-4 split among the justices. You had the 4 conservatives who were kind of ready to throw up their hands and say, we want to get the courts out of the business of dealing with gerrymandering entirely. You had the 4 more liberal justices who seemed ready to try and step in and put a stop to gerrymandering. And then you had Justice Kennedy in the middle. And unfortunately, Justice Kennedy again failed to kind of make up his mind on the question in that case, and things were punted down the road for another decade. And in all of this time, the Supreme Court is becoming more and more conservative, and conservative justices have tended to be much more skeptical of lawsuits trying to challenge gerrymandering under equal protection. And that finally kind of culminated in the 2018 ruling in the case of Rucho versus Common Cause, which was a case coming out of North Carolina, actually challenging a gerrymander that was instigated by Thomas Hoffler. He had been knocking around since the 1980s, kind of sticking his fingers in various different Republican gerrymandering efforts across the country. And this was another piece of his handiwork. He had drawn the districts in North Carolina so that in a moderately competitive state, Republicans were winning 10 out of the 13 US House seats, pretty much regardless of how the people were voting. And in that case, in an opinion that was written by Chief Justice John Roberts, the Supreme Court finally declared that that gerrymandering is going to be what's called a non-justiciable political question. It's something that the courts are going to wash their hands of, in a sense, and they're going to leave it to the political branches of government to figure out themselves, which is a problem because when the issue is that elections are getting rigged by politicians, it's kind of difficult to unrig those elections by voting for different politicians. The problem is right there in the elections themselves. And this is the problem we continue to confront. We have seen quite a bit of success since then, challenging gerrymanders in state court. There were successful lawsuits in both Pennsylvania and North Carolina towards the tail end of last decade. One of those was a League of Women Voters lawsuit that was brought. There were successful efforts in Florida as well. And we're starting to see this decade state level challenges to gerrymanders become a lot more prevalent. We saw it in New York, where the New York Court of Appeals struck down the Democratic gerrymander of New York's House of Representatives districts. We've seen challenges in places like Michigan and Ohio and Wisconsin as well. And of course, we have the legal effort in Utah by the League of Women Voters to try and take on the gerrymandering of Utah's congressional districts. But the problem with lawsuits as a remedy here is that they take a lot of work, they're expensive, they take a long time for these lawsuits to work their way through the courts. And at the end of the process, you have no real guarantee of success. You're hoping that you can convince a majority of the justices on the state Supreme Court to step in and overturn a gerrymander, which is why in the book, I advocate for direct action by the people to try and address this problem, for people to organize petitions, to gather signatures, to try and get statutes and constitutional amendments on the ballot in their state to remove the power over redistricting from the hands of self-interested politicians who, as we've seen, will always give in to the temptation to try and use the process for their own purposes. And the only way we can really fix this is to take politicians out of the equation, to turn over redistricting to some kind of independent commission that is insulated from political influence.
Nick, you said at the very beginning of our conversation that our roots in gerrymandering come from England, as a lot of our law and our political system does. How many other countries in the world who do districting, how many of them still allow politicians to draw their own maps?
Almost none of them. What I do in the conclusion of the book is to basically research the redistricting practices from democracies across the world. And out of all of those nations, I was only able to find one, and that is France, that along with the United States still gives elected representatives, elected politicians, a role in the process of drawing districts. Every other nation has already created some kind of independent entity. And in some nations, it's a government agency. So you have non-political, non-partisan bureaucrats who draw the districts based on neutral principles. That system is used, for instance, in places like Germany. And In other nations, including the UK and Canada, you have some kind of independent commission, an entirely separate entity that has the sole responsibility of redrawing districts. It's kind of ironic that gerrymandering originated in England and was kind of imported over here to the United States. And yet Great Britain figured out more than a century ago that it's a good idea to take politicians out of the equation. And in the early 20th century, that was when not just in the UK, but throughout the British Commonwealth, they created these boundary commissions, as they call them, to redraw districts independently. And a century later, we in the United States are still struggling to fix this problem that we imported from our British ancestors.
So Nick, this brings up the Independent Redistricting Commission. There are a number of states who have them. Utah, notably, since we're in Utah, had a Utah Independent Redistricting Commission that the League watched, and we found did excellent work in a very transparent way and a very nonpartisan way, or at least bipartisan way. Were you able to see the work that the Utah Independent Redistricting Commission did?
I was. And in particular, I saw the US House of Representatives map that they drew, which I thought was extremely fair. The issue in Utah, of course, is that you have kind of this large urban center in Salt Lake City, which is where a large percentage of the Democrats in the state of Utah live. And then you have these surrounding areas that are heavily Republican. And I think the fairest way to go about drawing a map for Utah under those circumstances is to draw a Salt Lake City district, which is what the commission did, and then to kind of divide the rest of the state into more rural and suburban districts. That's kind of a fair, impartial, nonpartisan way to draw those districts. The problem, of course, with the Utah Commission is that it was only an advisory commission, and that the state legislature retained the authority to either accept the recommendation of the commission and adopt their map, or to go ahead and draw their own map. And in my research, I found that advisory commissions are generally not all that effective. There's one that was put in place in New York as well, and the exact same thing happened in New York as happened in Utah. The advisory commission drew up a fair map, and then the state legislature stepped in and substituted their own map in place of that. And in Utah, what they did was, instead of drawing a district for Salt Lake City, they divided Salt Lake City between 4 different districts. Essentially, they broke up the constituencies within the city and parceled them out among 4 different surrounding districts, and drew a map where every single district in the state is a safe Republican seat. Democrats in New York did exactly the same thing. They drew a map that created about the maximum possible number of Democratic seats in the state of New York. So this is certainly not a Republican problem or a Democratic problem. I think what we see when we look across the country is that anytime you give the politicians an opportunity to get their foot in the door, if it's just an advisory commission that they have the ability to overrule, they're going to take that opportunity. And fortunately, in New York, there was a lawsuit, and that Democratic gerrymander was overturned by the New York Court of Appeals. Hopefully, we see something similar happening in Utah, and the lawsuit by the League of Women Voters will be successful, and we'll see a fairer map put in place for the state of Utah. But the most successful commissions have been the ones that remove the process from the hands of politicians entirely and don't give them any mechanism to be able to influence the outcome. And the model redistricting commissions that I talk about in the book are the citizens redistricting commissions, where regular Americans are the ones who have the responsibility for drawing the maps. And they're chosen at random from anyone who's interested who can apply. They're balanced between registered Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and they are entirely insulated from political influence. And those citizens' commissions have been used to great success in states like California and Michigan and Colorado. And my hope for this next decade is that we see efforts to try and create such commissions in other states as well. And I'm hoping to be able to launch such an effort here in Florida to try and get an initiative on the ballot for the 2024 election to create a Florida Citizens Redistricting Commission.
Well, kudos to you. And Nick, you anticipated, I asked a couple of people for questions in advance, and I'd like to pause just a moment as we're reaching the end of our hour to let people know that there is a chat box in this Facebook Live feed. You can drop a question in there if you have a question for Nick, and I will ask those questions of him. So you outlined, and the question that you were sort of answering was this outline of what an effective, and by that I mean fair and not subject to the whims of power, redistricting commission looks like. So you outlined a citizens commission. What other components are we looking at when we look at a commission like that?
There are some states that have commissions that are independent in that they're not part of the state government itself, and their membership does not consist of politicians, but which are still in some ways subject to political influence. And I think those types of commissions can sometimes be effective. For instance, the New Jersey Independent Redistricting Commission is what I label a bipartisan commission, in that it's made up of equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. And those members are appointed by sometimes the governor, sometimes the leadership of the state legislature, but you have a different selection process for those bipartisan commissions than you do for the citizens commissions. The New Jersey Commission also has an independent tie-breaking vote, who is usually some kind of independent redistricting expert, often a political science professor or someone like that. And these commissions can work effectively, especially when they have an independent tie-breaking vote, but they are still susceptible to political influence because politicians get to appoint the members of the commission themselves, which is why I prefer the Citizens Commission model, because not only are politicians not on the commission, but you have a selection process that is entirely independent of political influence.
So do you have, the other question that somebody asked me was, given that Utah had a Utah Independent Redistricting Commission, it actually started out as a commission that had force of law and then was modified by a bill from the legislature to make it an advisory commission. Those of us who live in states who have advisory commissions, who've had the will of the citizen, and I'm thinking back here to, I wrote this down, I was so struck by it. One of the cases you cited was a SCOTUS decision in 1995, U.S. Term Limits v. Thornton, in which J.P. Stevens wrote, "The right to choose representatives belongs not to the states, but to the people." So what is your advice to those of us who are in states where it has been removed from the people to be able to claw that power back to the people where it rightfully belongs?
Well, I think you rightfully identify that the people have to be the driver of this change. I think it's possible to try and influence politicians to reform redistricting, but it's extremely difficult to convince people who hold power to voluntarily give up that power. It can be done, but I've talked quite a bit this evening about, this afternoon, I guess, where you are in Utah, about the strong incentives that exist for politicians to resist those types of political pressures, which is why Direct democracy, the ability of citizens to place policy questions directly on the ballot through a signature petition, is the best tool that we have to try and reform gerrymandering. And unfortunately, not every state has direct democracy. In fact, only 26 of the 50 states even have a mechanism by which citizens can implement political change directly. And in certain states, like Utah, for instance, this can only be done through initiated statute, right? So you cannot directly amend the state constitution, which is unfortunate because it leads to situations like the one you just talked about, where the people vote for one thing through a statutory initiative, and then the legislature repeals that and substitutes its own judgment for what the people had dictated. Other states like Florida allow citizens to directly amend their constitution, and that is the best mechanism. But even initiated statutes can be effective, and they can send a message to politicians that what they're doing is unpopular, that the people are opposed to their kind of gerrymandering machinations. And ultimately, if you place enough pressure on them, if you make it so that the political downside of gerrymandering is greater than the political upside they get from manipulating the districts, perhaps that's the tipping point which will persuade them that they need to listen to their constituents. But unfortunately, while the solution itself is simple, independent redistricting commissions, achieving that solution is extremely difficult, and it's something that needs to be done on a state-by-state basis. But it's something that we have made progress with, and I think it's something that we will continue to make progress with in the future.
Okay. Nick, we're almost done, but I have one more question. Out of all of the stuff that you discovered in this book and in the research that you've done over the years, what is the thing that you have found that most surprised you?
I think the thing that most surprised me was how influential gerrymandering was in the career of America's most famous president, Abraham Lincoln, widely regarded to be the best president in US history, and how fundamentally gerrymandering altered his career trajectory. Because before he ran for president in 1860, Abraham Lincoln ran for the Senate seat from the state of Illinois in 1858. This was the election where we had the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, some of the greatest oratory and debate among candidates in American history. I kind of wish our presidential debates today looked a little bit more like the Lincoln-Douglas debates of yesteryear. But the problem Lincoln ran into when he ran for Senate in 1858 was that the Democrats had gerrymandered the Illinois state legislature. And at the time, state legislatures were responsible for selecting members of the US Senate. And so when the campaign was over, the gerrymander was enough to keep the Democrats in power in Springfield, and they predictably went with Douglas over Lincoln for that Senate seat. But were it not for that gerrymander, Abraham Lincoln could have been elected to the US Senate in 1858. And this was one of the most pivotal moments in US history. He was denied a Senate seat, and so he turned around and decided to run for president. Would he still have done that if he had been less than 2 years into a 6-year term as a US Senator? How would the Civil War have played out if Abraham Lincoln hadn't run for president in 1860? That, I think, is by far the most interesting gerrymandering story, because it fundamentally affected one of the most crucial moments in US history and a key point in the career of America's greatest president, Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating story. If those of you in Facebook land, have been intrigued by these stories of Patrick Henry and his gerrymander in an attempt to force an Article 5 constitutional convention, or the gerrymander of that gave us Abraham Lincoln as president, or even and especially information about the Supreme Court and how it has just thrown up its hands about gerrymandering and what we can do in the states and as voters and as citizens in our respective states, please do pick up a copy of Nick's book, One Person, One Vote. If you need more information about the League of Women Voters and Mormon Women for Ethical Government lawsuit challenging the congressional maps, please visit the League website at lwv.utah.org. You can buy Nick's book at quality bookstores everywhere. I urge you to use the quality bookstore wellerbookworks.com. There is a link to purchase the book in the chat. Nick, thank you so much for this fascinating this discussion today. I really enjoyed this walk through history and currency. As we spoke about at the beginning, I feel like I've been steeped in gerrymandering over the past many years now, and I have been. And yet I still learned a lot and was enormously entertained by your book and talking with you again as well. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Catherine. It's been fun.
And thank you, everybody. Again, please go to lwvutah.org for information on gerrymandering in Utah, or wellerbookworks.com to order Nick's book. Have a good day, everyone. Goodbye.